Right, good evening. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Quarterhouse for the sixth in a series of 7 Plotting the Clearings. Tonight I'd like to welcome Professor Pippa Catterall, who teaches history and policy at the University of Westminster and is also the chair of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust. Tonight's talk will be on art, placemaking and inclusion. At the very end of her talk, well, what you'll find, this is interesting in that we have an interactive section. So you will have to use your smartphones at some point, or maybe just put up your hands if you don't have a smart device. So this is the first time we've had an interactive poll as part of the talks. And there will be a question and answer section at the end of the talk as well. So thank you, Pippa.
Thank you very much, Liv. I arrive here in a state of some trepidation. I've never been to Folkestone before Sunday, so I spent Sunday doing about 10 miles walking round all the art I could find in the town, and there's a lot of it. And it was fascinating looking at all of these things. To try and case the joints, as it were. I'm also told that I'm following on from a stand-up comedian and a thrill engineer. So that means I've got a hard act to follow. So thanks very much for that, Liv, as well as for your very generous introduction. I'm probably not going to be giving you as much thrills or comedy as you might wish. Indeed, in some ways, what I'm going to be talking about is quite serious. But also I think quite topical, because part of the reason for thinking about inclusion in public spaces, which is where my talk is taking us, is because too many people are not included in public spaces. And this is something that we should be extremely aware of in our current circumstances. So hate crime has been steadily going up over the last few years in this country, but at least they record hate crime in this country, whereas in most countries they don't. Or, if you look at some of our erstwhile partners in Europe, the recording of hate crime is extremely patchy. There are certain types of hate crime which are not recorded effectively by the police, such as misogyny. But we are, of course, meeting in the light of the murders of people like Sabina Nessa and Sarah Everard, and indeed a graduate of my university was murdered last year in a park in North London. So there are some sobering thoughts about, well, what makes for these kinds of activities in public space, and how can you make public space safer and more inclusive for everyone? And I got interested in this a few years ago when I saw a play called Love Song to Lavender, Menace at the Edinburgh Fringe. Love Song to Lavender, Menace is a play about the first gay bookshop to open in Edinburgh after homosexual acts between adult men were legalised there in 1980. And it starts off with this guy talking about sneaking through the streets of Edinburgh. And he says words to the effect of, "Fuck me, even the buildings are homophobic." And what he meant by that was, sorry, apologies for the obscenity there, but I'm trying to give a kind of flavour. Though not in a very good Edinburgh accent. What he was expressing was the way in which the buildings of Edinburgh express a certain type of authority. So you have an awful lot of buildings which speak of Presbyterian disapproval of deviant forms of sexuality. And he is very, the character in the play is very conscious of traversing the city until he gets into the safe space of the gay bookshop, where he can suddenly no longer have to edit himself. Because he is conscious that all the way there, he is conspicuous, he is vulnerable, and he is likely to fall prey to people who might gay bash. And watching this got me interested in, so how do you make spaces safer? Not just for LGBTQ people, but for everyone. Because if you can create good design which is inclusive, then it will be inclusive for everyone. Some of the people who are most vulnerable to hate crime in public space, any guesses as to which protected group are most vulnerable to hate crime in public spaces? No? Disabled people. And so one of the things we need to think about is how do you make these spaces more inclusive? And of course that also raises the question, how do you desist the activities of those people who would attack them? Interestingly enough, there is very little research on why people perpetrate hate crimes. So much of the research concentrates on the victims, not the perpetrators. So we need to think about, well, how do you reduce the tendency to attack people in public spaces as well? So I'm going to be talking about the relationship between inclusivity in spaces and the way in which placemaking, creating a sense of identity, and the use of art in the process of doing so might help to reduce some of these facets. As a result of me seeing this, I got talking 2 years ago at a party run by Historic England, of course, to a guy who happens to be a Syrian refugee. He comes from Homs. His city more or less ceased to exist because it was bombed to smithereens during the Syrian civil war. And he's very interested in how that impacts upon your sense of home and who you are. His research is all about what he calls urbicide, the murder of cities. And of course, in the process of doing that, you're undermining people's sense of who they are, their sense of self, the sense of place, and the way in which individuals navigate spaces. What's happening with Homs now, after the civil war has kind of ended, is that the Assad regime, is replanning it in a way in which all the old markers of how people identified that city, how they navigated it, are being expunged and being replaced by new markers which indicate the authority structures of that state. In other words, the way in which people made place in Homs by going, okay, here's the clock, this is how we identify key spaces in this, has been expunged in favour of something which establishes an authority narrative from the point of view of the state. So in talking to Amar about this kind of thing, we got interested in the notion of authorised public space discourse. The way in which public spaces are not shaped by the public, but by the way in which authorities manage those spaces. They manage them by planning laws, they manage them by licensing, they manage them by policing, they manage them by ownership, they manage them by taxation. Spaces are not, just like museums are not neutral, spaces are not neutral. And we need to think about how do you make them as inclusive and as accessible, and the two things are not the same, for everyone as possible. So we started working on this and we ended up coming up with this report, which if you're interested in what I'm saying today, you can find on the web. It's free, you can download it. It's only about 6,000 words, it's got some nice pictures in, and you can read it. And you can look at the recommendations about how we might change some of the ways in which authority structures operate in order to make places more inclusive and accessible. So, for instance, we have an article coming out in the Town and Country Planning Association journal as soon as I get round to checking the proofs, in which we argue, if you look at the planning regime in this country, it's very problematic because it's historically constructed around a view that the labour market is primarily engaged in by men. So you have transport systems which are designed around male commuting. You have transport systems which are designed around the demands of the car. And again, men tend to use cars more than women. And there is an inequality fundamental to that, and you can find this all over the world. So until you start changing those systems and rethinking how you design cities, you cannot produce more inclusivity. So we can have, as indeed we have on this slide here, a checklist of these are the kinds of things we ought to have in public space in order to make it inclusive. And this comes from an article, as you can see, from 2018. And there's a lot to be said for having some kind of checklist and being able to say, okay, well, when we design new public space, does it tick all these boxes? And if it does, maybe that's okay. The problem with any kind of checklist is that it can be gamed. So just looking at these checklists is not sufficient. What we also need to do is make sure that planners, when they're designing spaces, are also engaging with user groups, particularly vulnerable user groups, particularly people who find it difficult to engage in certain spaces. There's also one thing which is conspicuously absent from Peter Carmona's list, which is the freedom to express affection in public space. A survey in Denmark in 2018 found that half of the gay people in Denmark will not hold their partner's hand in public. Now, Denmark is the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage in 1989. Legalized male homosexuality as long ago as 1933. You have a sense that you're going to be vulnerable if you express affection in public. And sometimes that vulnerability comes particularly in areas where you think you're going to be safer. So I have in my hand here, and I shall pass this around for you to have a look at, a recent book by Jack Giesenking about lesbian New York. And in it, Jack talks about the ways in some of the spaces where you're most likely to be attacked are on the edges of, quote, gay areas, where you're particularly vulnerable. So if you, as you're crossing 6th Avenue, anyone here know New York, apart from me? A bit. So as you're crossing 6th Avenue to go into Greenwich Village, which is seen as one of the gayest parts of New York, that's where you drop the hand of your girlfriend, because you're suddenly very vulnerable on a major highway. You feel very conspicuous. So how do you create a situation in which people don't have to edit themselves in public space and can feel included when they're in those spaces? Not least because of the way in which the gaze in public space is dominated by men. So as you walk, as you traverse public space, it is men who do the looking and it is women who are looked at. It is men who have the freedom to occupy those spaces, to make noise in those public spaces, and women who frequently don't. One of the things you often, I've given talks about this to lots of groups of architects and town planners and so on, and sometimes the women will go, yeah, you've made me realise that when I'm walking through public spaces, I walk like this. I never meet the eyes of anyone I'm walking past, because I don't want to attract attention to myself. So whose space is it, and whose gaze is it in those spaces? And what we've got here is some examples of the way in which spaces can be very inegalitarian. Over here you've got something which is conspicuously a microaggression. No, where are you really from? Now, someone who expresses that to you clearly feels a sense of privilege and entitlement to be aggressive in that way. Because the implication is there is a default setting. There is a default setting in which we can operate in public spaces, which is around a white male norm. Indeed, lots of spaces are designed by white male cis people who encode their views into the way in which they design those spaces. Over here you have the cover of a book written by an American anthropologist called Claude Steele, Whistling Vivaldi. He's talking about the way in which African Americans, though it happens in this country as well, can be walking down the street and they notice white people cross the road so as to not be near them. The book starts off with him telling the story of he's walking through San Francisco and he starts whistling Vivaldi's Four Seasons because he's signalling, no, I don't listen to grime. No, I'm not a rapper. No, I'm not a druggie. All of those stereotypes which are immediately foisted upon him simply because of the colour of his skin. And then this is, in the middle, a picture I took in Birmingham earlier this year. 10 o'clock at night, you've got two women dancing in the mirror pool outside the Birmingham City Library. I think they feel pretty included because they obviously felt they could dance there. So what that raises is, what makes for them to feel safe, and how can we create that sense of safety for everyone in spaces so that you don't have these inequalities, everyone can feel these spaces are theirs. Well, here's another view of Birmingham, not far from that library. This is the Bullring as built in the 1960s. Lovely, isn't it? One of the things that was most noticeable about this was how it was designed by men in a way which made it really difficult for women to navigate. If you're using pushchairs and trying to get through all these very confusing alleyways, if you've got bags of shopping and so on, this was a really unfriendly space. It looked really nice on the drawing board. But that doesn't make it a space which is friendly for women. This, on the other hand, is the suburb of Aspen in Vienna, which in Vienna and Copenhagen in particular, also in Stockholm, they have been trying to design particular suburbs to be female friendly. So they've reconstructed train stations, they've rethought about the lighting, they've thought about the layout of spaces. So look at the comparison between the two layouts, much more greenery, curves, and a more open and welcoming space. One of the things as well to look at here is the type of lighting you use. So it's often tempting for people to talk about, well, let's put more lighting into a space because that will make it feel safer. Does security lighting make anywhere feel safer? Do you feel safer when you see security lighting? Security lighting is designed to protect property, not people. And it's usually very harsh, so it creates pools of light and dark. One of our colleagues on the study has been doing lots of work on women's safety and mapping women's safety routes in Australia, which is where she works. And one of the things she found was that we need to be thinking about ambient lighting. We need to be thinking about creating pools of warm light as ways of making space safer, rather than the intensity of light. It's the quality of light, it's the positioning of the light which needs to be thought about. Okay, this is where I ask you the first of my questions. Does this look like a safe space? Does this look inclusive? Don't all speak at once. No, anyone disagree? They've spent millions on this space. So this is Bradford. I did some of the work for my PhD in Bradford in the 1980s. And it was pretty grim then. It had been, the Victorian heart of the city was ripped out in the 1960s. This is all reconstructed very recently. And as you say, it still doesn't look terribly inclusive. You've got authority structures at the back. So you've got the town hall, which, okay, Victorian. Over here, you've got the magistrates' court. If you want to create inclusive spaces, public spaces, you don't put them right next to a magistrates' court. Also, what you can't see in shot is just over here is a Wetherspoons. If you're trying to create a nice kind of continental style cafe culture space, you don't put a Wetherspoons in it. Because what you as you walk past that Wetherspoons, if you're female, you get unwanted attention. Walking across that space 2 months ago, you got constantly, "Can I have your number, love?" Etc. It was lovely. It was one of the more unpleasant public spaces I've been in recently. So yes, I would agree with you. It's definitely not an inclusive space. Oops. So this is where you have to vote. So you have, if you've got mobile phones, you go to this thing at the top. So you put into your search engines poll, ev, etc., etc., and then it should, I hope, come up with an option for you to vote on. Do you think, yes, someone's succeeded, do you think heritage in public space is inclusive? This is, of course, a topic which has been very politically sensitive in recent times, in light of things like the Colston statue and the whole debate around are statues history? It should be blindingly obvious statues are not history. And as a professional historian, I can spend some time explaining to you why statues are not history, should you wish. But statues, one way in which we can know that statues are not history is that you may not know who this is. Anyone guess who it is? Flora MacDonald. This is outside Inverness Town Hall. It's put up about 150 years after she died. So obviously it's a really good likeness. It's one of 20 statues of women in Scotland, which are not statues of Queen Victoria. I mean, essentially, most statues of women in this country are statues of Queen Victoria. And most of the other statues of women in this country are like the statue in front of the monument to Sir Arthur Sullivan in Embankment Gardens in London, of a half-naked woman draped across his monument. In other words, women as kind of eye candy. So, do we think it's inclusive? Well, we seem to be ending up at the bottom end of the spectrum here, and I think that's probably right. How many gay people are commemorated in this country in statues. There are fewer statues of gay people than there are of slavers. Still, I mean, Colston made his money by working for the Royal Africa Company. The person who was the president of the Royal Africa Company was a guy called James II. You may have heard of him. There's a statue of him outside the National Gallery, still. Most people don't know about those unsavoury connections, however. So, is heritage inclusive in public space? Well, no. I mean, essentially, once you get beyond Alan Turing, it's quite difficult to think of gay people who were commemorated in public space. So we need to move beyond just going, well, there is some kind of representation. I'm not saying we should have more statues of gay people. I think we need to rethink public realm. The public realm we have is essentially a legacy from the Victorian period. So much of it was laid out, designed and created in the Victorian period. Some of it is created in the 1960s. Some of it is really disruptive of communities. And you can see that in this city here. It's one of the things, one of the points which is highlighted down on the harbour, where you've got road systems which have disrupted cities. And the post-war obsession with the motor car, both here and in the US and in most other Western countries, has been really disruptive of communities. So we need to think about how do we get beyond these structures. I've called this slide Beyond BS 8300. So British Standard 8300 is the standard on inclusive design. If you look at it, it mentions virtually nothing other than disabled access. There's almost nothing about socio-economic inclusion. So where do people live? The physical barriers between rich and poor communities, the way in which so many poorer communities still have really bad transport connections compared to richer communities, which is a legacy of the Victorian period. There's very little about inclusion for non-physical disabilities, such as neurodiversity. There's almost nothing about LGBTQ inclusion, women's inclusion, and so on. Lots of reports on these things, very little actually incorporated in official documentation. And indeed, in some ways, things have been getting worse. You may have heard of a phenomenon called hostile design. Here you can see an example of hostile design. That park bench quite deliberately has a divide along it so that homeless people can't sleep on it. This is in a country where we don't know how many people are dying each year of homelessness, but it's somewhere north of 500, which is something we should be extremely ashamed of. And when we think about the ways in which the authorities try to include people, this is from London. We won't tolerate hate. Let's use a negative, shall we, to include people. As I went round Edinburgh this year, I was really pleased to see be kind everywhere. Let's start off by being positive. Try to give people positive messaging. The research on people who commit hate crimes, such as it is, tends to suggest that they are cowards, quelle surprise, that they tend to hunt in packs, and that they're relatively easily desisted. Partly through things like contact theory. So, for instance, if you know people who are of a kind you feel scared or anxious about, if you've actually met people like that, you're less likely to be hostile to them because the hostility is directed at the unknown. So, for instance, if you've met more Muslims, you won't react like so many of my relatives in the north of England, like, oh, I wouldn't go to London because it's a really scary place. And so much of the north is hugely divided along ethnic grounds because of those kinds of attitudes. That is not a good way of reducing hostility. So we need to get beyond those kinds of things. We also need to get beyond simply making irony. I think this is great. I mean, these pieces by David Strigley, one in Folkestone, one in a different place, you may be familiar with, and of course, Strigley is being ironic. A lot of people didn't understand that his really good was a piece of irony. And this up here is a piece of white noise, or rather, it's an illustration of how people interact with public realm, or don't interact with public realm. So the Cambridge historian J. Winter used to ask his students, he works on the First World War, where is the Cambridge War Memorial? None of them could tell him. It's just outside the station. You pass it as you go into Cambridge from the station. You can't miss it, except of course they all did, because it was just white noise in stone. People didn't notice Colston's statue until someone pulled it down, until it became a cause célèbre. So, how do you get beyond that kind of situation? And you also need to get beyond the idea that we include people by having spaces which are exclusive to them. So 2 years ago, there was something called the Gayborhood Foundation started, which has started designating areas as gayborhoods, places where LGBTQ people like myself can feel safe, which is wonderful. So you've got the Canal Street in Manchester, you've got the area in Birmingham, you've got Hebden Bridge, arguably, in Yorkshire, and so on. This is actually Stanley Street. This is the Pride Quarter of Liverpool. I don't think it looks particularly like a gayborhood at all. The only thing which tells you it's a gayborhood is because they've got the rainbow flag on the street signs. Essentially, what happened was the gayborhood in Liverpool used to be in a place appropriately known as Queen Square. And then the city decided to redevelop it and created the St. John's Shopping Centre in the 1970s. It's a horrible 1970s development, as so many of them were. And they moved the gayborhood here. It's not where the gayborhood would naturally have settled, in other words. It's been relocated as a result of redevelopment. And this is one of the things which happens with gayborhoods. They're incredibly vulnerable to redevelopment, same as happened in Christopher Street in New York, where the Stonewall Inn is, partly because gay people generally don't own the buildings. If you look at most gayborhoods in Britain, they're not residential. And so you don't have a sustainable community in those areas. And if people go, okay, actually the het pound is worth more than the pink pound, you're out. So these communities are vulnerable. Also, most gayborhoods are centered around gay men because gay men have more money. And you find, for instance, that, I mean, if you look at the book I've just circulated, you'll find that a lot of the lesbian districts in New York have disappeared in recent years simply because rents are too high. Which is why I'm saying you need to think about a whole series of things which construct the way in which the city works. Okay, second question for you. Are rainbow crossings inclusive? I couldn't find one in Folkestone. There's plenty in other places now. Do you think these are inclusive or not? What do you think? It's actually a trick question because arguably it's both. There was a recent newspaper report from Gloucestershire where people were saying there is no gay pubs in this area. There are no gay community centres. There's nothing. And then they've just put in a rainbow crossing. And I can see that and I can go, I'm not the only gay in the village. I actually feel included now. I feel safer. I mean, I feel safer when I see a rainbow flag than when I see an England flag. So it can be a way of inclusivity, but it can also, of course, be pinkwashing, particularly when you have rainbow capitalists using it as a way of saying, yes, we're really inclusive, which often doesn't quite jive with how they treat their gay workers. Okay, well, this is an example of placemaking in Folkestone. So some of you may be familiar with this. I think this guy's Vince Laws. And what you've got here is examples of using text to think about how can you repurpose and occupy a space. Because one of the things with a lot of spaces is that they reflect the intentions and structuring of the people who created them. What we could think about is as artistic interventions which change them. One of my favourite examples of this, which I didn't put on the slides, maybe I should have done, was there's a monument to the Red Army, the Soviet Army, in the centre of Sofia in Bulgaria, which since 2011 has been regularly repainted. So in 2011 it was repainted so that all the Soviet soldiers suddenly looked like Captain America, Santa Claus, Ronald McDonald, and so on. It's great. And underneath, the caption read in Bulgarian, "In pace with the times." You could argue that you could take a statue, you could take a space and repurpose it by querying it. In a sense, of course, that's what the Triennial does. You're repurposing spaces by artistic interventions. Just round the back of the building I teach in is a plinth which was erected to hold the statue to Bloody Cumberland, the victor of the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The statue was removed in 1868, so it is possible to remove statues in this country, particularly when they stink. In 2012, the Korean artist Mi Kyung-shin put up a replica of the statue on the plinth, made of soap. And gradually it washed away, symbolically washing away the blood of Bloody Cumberland. I thought that was a very clever way in which you can use art to intervene and undermine the way in which we can think about a space. You will recognise, well, I should imagine those of you who are Folkestone residents will recognise this space. This is, of course, the Creative Quarter. And what I like about this is that it's light, it's got colours, it's got social capital. And all of these things are the kinds of design features that you need to create spaces. The American commentator Jane Jacobs famously pointed out that the more social capital you have on a street, the safer it is, because you have passive surveillance. Passive surveillance, surveillance by other people, is much safer than CCTV. CCTV might catch them after you've been killed. But if you've got other people on the street anyway, people are much less likely to commit offences in the first place. Remember, most of these people are cowards. So if you can build spaces which have a lot of social capital, then hopefully you can create spaces which are more inclusive. One of the things which also comes out from research is that a lot of gay bashing happens in spaces, or a lot of hate crime happens in spaces where you are recognised but not known. So you are seen as being an intruder in a space. For instance, friends of mine a few years ago on a housing estate in Reading were firebombed out of that estate because one of them was trans. And so they got moved. They're now in Coventry. But so it's about people recognizing you as different and not accepting you as different within a community. And some of the housing estates we have are designed to create a sense of a normative family, which does not necessarily conduce to including people who don't fit in to those kinds of structures. I think that this slide is good because it shows a number of ways in which you can create design features which are inclusive, so lighting, colours, different kinds of scale. So if I go back for a second, you've got different roof lines, you've got a curve on the street, all of which I think helps to create a more inclusive kind of space. So this is what seems to me to be a kind of macro intervention. These are, if you like, micro interventions. So as you go around Liverpool, you'll find lots of these created by a group called Sine Missione. And they've usually got rather nice messages on them as well. They don't get graphed. You don't see tags on any of these. And they appear on things like transformer boxes and so on. They're usually fairly small scale and on the street. And you just pass them and go, yeah, that's a nice message. And it's inclusive message. This is from Bristol. I also think this is a really, really nice little message. And maybe there's some ideas that you could use in the Folkestone Triennial here, because, of course, what you're doing here is querying, and I'm using it as a verb, not a noun here, the authorised discourse of where you can park. And say, actually, no, let's just think about how beautiful we all are, and how nice it is to be human, and how nice it would be if we treated everyone else as human too. In the middle, you've got my friend Kit Hyam demonstrating, if you like, guerrilla heritage, the way in which you can just put up little plaques to go, here's a piece of LGBTQ heritage, here's a piece of black and global majority heritage, here's a piece of whatever heritage, just to indicate you're not alone, you're not the only person in this kind of space. So to conclude, what I've been trying to talk about is how you can, how problematic public spaces can be, how there are legacies which help to create spaces where people can feel very vulnerable. And in a climate of growing hate crime, we need to think about that. One of the ways in which you can do that is by getting people to be aware and accepting of a greater range of identities within space. And that means getting beyond tolerance. What we've had in this country is a gradual extension of tolerance. The Equality Act of 2010 is about toleration, by saying some people have protected characteristics and therefore they are protected under the law. But that's not the same as saying these people should be accepted for what they are, and we should just regard them as human beings and accept them in that way. And this is what this term usualizing means. If you think about, sometimes when I do these talks, people say to me, well, why don't you use the term normalizing? And it's because normalizing implies that there is a norm. And the opposite of normal is abnormal. So that makes me abnormal. Lovely. Whereas if you talk about usualizing, you go, well, okay, being unusual doesn't sound nearly as bad. Usualizing is going, everyone who appears in public space as human is actually usual. They have a role in that space. This is happening in the classrooms already, and it's something we need to think about in public space as well. We can do this, or we can help to take this forward by placemaking. So we have here, this is the monument to Alan Turing, or one of the monuments to Alan Turing in Manchester. You also have a sign in which Jane Jacobs, think about it, how many streets are named after women around the world? How many? One of the ways in which Vienna has been trying to make it a more female-friendly city is by naming streets after women, and saying that women actually have a space in these kinds of settings. And all of these things are, if you like, simple, easy, quick wins interventions which can help to promote a move towards creating spaces which are more inclusive. Thank you all very much for listening. And I apologise that there weren't more jokes, but...
I'm just going to use this very quickly, and then it's up to the audience to ask questions. I'd like to say thank you, Pippa, for your talk. And I'm probably going to open the questions with, because I know you did an extensive tour of Folkestone, so if you could pick an artwork that you felt was inclusive, or more inclusive than you expected, maybe. So an artwork you were surprised by.
I think the one which springs to mind immediately is the one which is facing the statue to William Harvey. One, because it is obviously inclusive, because it's referencing disability of various kinds, because of the way in which that structure in itself is very colourful, but also because it's deliberately intervening in a space which is speaking of authority. So you have Harvey on that plinth. This is classic Western statuary, and our ideas of what makes a statue goes way back to antiquity, to Greek and Roman times. So you've got Harvey on that plinth, and indeed, if you look at the statue of James II that I referred to earlier, he's dressed like a Roman emperor, obviously. In the 17th century, that's how kings dressed. No. And so you've got Harvey looking very classical, and you've got this intervention which is undermining that and also speaking to that, and at the same time saying this is one of the reasons why Harvey's important. So I think it's clarifying that, and it is saying that disabled people have a role in public space. So yeah, I do really like that particular piece. Any others? I mean, I think just having public art can be useful, although I think some public art feels too much like window dressing, and I think public art should be spiky and should make us think. Not on the current trails, but from a previous trail, something which really spoke to me was the holiday home on the Harbour Arm. Indeed, I was thinking I should have added a further slide here about how can you have inclusion if people can't live? How can you have inclusion if people can't get houses? Well, you can't really. And we're living in a society where it costs so much to get onto the property ladder that this is something that we really need to think about. And there are so many ways in which there are inequalities in the way in which things like property are taxed. In another life, I sit on the Valuation Tribunal for England. That means I have to assess what council tax people pay. And I find myself sitting there going, okay, I've got to tell you what your house would have been worth 30 years before it was actually built. That's crazy. So we have tax systems which are not fit for purpose. and which create inequalities simply because of the way in which they're designed. So the holiday home one really speaks to me because you look at it and it's talking about the financialization of housing markets, the people who are making money out of housing markets, rather than seeing houses as things that people should be living in. And that has been the distortion of the British housing market. It's an explanation of why British houses are the smallest in Europe. It doesn't get reported in any of the mainstream press in this country, but that's something we should be really ashamed of. You know, Holland, much more crowded country than this one, has bigger houses than England. That's shocking. And it's because of the financialization of the housing markets. And you look at that and you go, how come artists are saying this, whereas no politician has the guts to say it? So yes, I think that is about inclusion.
Thank you for answering that. If anyone would like to put their hand up to ask a question.
Good evening. My name is Kitty and I am Dutch. I would like to ask you, where do you want to give a place in society for people who are forced asylum seekers?
It's a very good question. I probably don't share Priti Patel's view of the subject, I'm pleased to say. I think the way in which asylum seekers are treated in this country is shameful. If you look at the conditions in the places in which they are incarcerated, they are appalling. Not allowing asylum seekers to work works with a right-wing narrative of asylum seekers as being people who are attempting, economic migrants who are attempting to freeload on society. But of course it's a product of, it's a perverse outcome of the way in which these things are regulated. If I were in a position of power, I would take an entirely different view of the subject. Britain is a signatory of the UN Convention on Refugees, 1951, which was signed in the aftermath of the Second World War. And at the time, people thought of refugees in terms of what had just happened in Europe. What was not envisaged was the kind of refugee situation we have now, where you have most refugees are not in Europe. Most refugees, if you look around the world, there are millions of refugees in countries like Turkey. At one time in the 1990s, I think Malawi had the highest percentage of refugees of any country in the world because of the civil wars in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. The kinds of attitudes of Western governments of, oh well, you know, we'll give money to the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, or we'll make sure that they've got toilet facilities, which is of course important. It's really not an adequate response to those kinds of situations. So I think that the spirit of the UN Convention has been broken. I think the spirit of the Dublin II Convention of the EU, within the EU itself, has been broken. We know that Eastern European... Thank you. We know that Eastern European countries have been very reluctant to accept refugees. So when Angela Merkel responded to the refugee crisis in 2015, and what I would regard as the most powerful piece of photojournalism since the Vietnam War, the picture of was it Anam Kupri on that beach, by saying, yes, we will welcome refugees, it was something that surprised the civil servants. I mean, a friend of mine was one of the civil servants who was then charged with trying to work out what the policy was, which, you know, she'd just gone off piste and announced it. But a lot of East European countries refused to do anything about that, and were deliberately blocking these kinds of things. So Dublin 2 doesn't entirely work either. But yes, I think we should be welcoming to refugees. I also think we should be thinking about our responsibilities for what creates refugees in the first place. So yeah, there is a debate about how far climate change has contributed to the civil war in Syria and the ensuing crisis there of refugees. You know, what is it, 6 million people displaced? But what we do know is that as a result of drought in Syria, about 2 million farmers moved to the cities in the period, in the immediate run-up to the civil war. That really didn't help create a sustainable society. And intervening once the refugee crisis has already started is really not a solution. We need to think about how anthropogenic crises, civil wars, famines, which are created by poor governance, are often spillover effects of interventions from elsewhere, including Cold War proxy wars and post-Cold War proxy wars, not least in the Middle East, where you've got a Cold War going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is leading to proxy wars and spillover effects. And one of those spillover effects is a refugee crisis. So, long answer, but it's an interesting question. Not directly related to what I was talking about, but it's still a really good question. You had a question as well, I think, someone over here, so.
I'll just speak. So I think one of the things that came up was like the authoritative spaces. That's obviously made by authorities. So spaces are made by authorities, whether it's the Bradford Square or 9 Elms is made by a different authority, but it's the production company that do it.
Mm.
And you could argue that Creative Folkestone is an authority because they run the Triennial and they affect the space of Folkestone itself, etc. So how do you have an authority that is building places? Because those are the ones that do it, but then it's non-authoritative or inclusive, and that kind of tension between needing an organising body, or is it that like guerrilla example you gave of guerrilla flats? That's like in a non-authoritative authority. Get over that.
That's a really good question, and even if you, I mean, Kit is a university lecturer, which in some ways makes him an authority figure as well, of course. So, how does this? Who are the public? How does the public speak? I mean, what is the public? In a sense, we're all members of the public, but corporately, what makes us the public? In a sense, I mean, in a sense, the public speaks through NGOs and so on, who, I mean, a lot of newspapers think that they represent the public. So the Daily Mail thinks it represents the public, called Daily Mail readers, a group in which I don't include myself. But you know, so you have different kinds of publics. One of the problems is, how do you incorporate the public? Because if you're going to do artistic interventions, you need to have inclusions, and people need to feel that this is their space. So earlier, Leif and I were talking about how do you prevent tagging of artworks. And I think the places where you're most likely to prevent tagging is where you have a sense of ownership from the local community, and particularly local young people. So you engage the local schools, you can even engage local youth clubs, local gangs, and talk about, so okay, what would you like to see in this space? When I'm talking about authorised public spaces, very often these are spaces which are articulated from a top-down point of view. So in many cases, the consultation with the public during the planning process happens when you've already designed it. Someone who was a SPAD, Special Advisor to the Blair government, once said, our approach to making public policy is really inclusive and democratic. Once we've decided what the policy is, we consult everyone. And you've already spotted what the problem with that sentence is. You should be consulting people before you start. So if you look at the planning process in this country, local authorities are supposed to do statements of community engagement. I don't know about here. I do know that I looked for a statement of inclusive design on the local authority, couldn't find it. Anything at all. If you look in London, you can find a statement of it from the mayor, but it only talks about accessibility. Some of the local authorities in London are better, but as you go across the 33 boroughs in London, 26% of them have got statements of community inclusion. One of those has a statement of how they're actually going to include the public. So only one of 33 boroughs actually has a plan for how they're going to include people in these kinds of exercises. And then there's a question of, well, who represents the public? Because there's always a risk that you've got the soi-disant leaders of community groups as well. If you go for a public inquiry, that's usually post hoc, you've already designed it. So ideally what you should be doing, and I have been in local government, I have got involved in this kind of thing, you should be going, when you're at planning brief stage, ideally you should be going and saying, okay, what would make you feel included? What kinds of things might help? Of course, the public are not always very clear about this. So I remember talking to the artist Andy Scott, who's a Glasgow-based sculptor. Does huge pieces of sculpture. So he designed the new Kelpies lock gates on the Caledonian Canal, I think it is. And he was telling me this story about he was designing a new piece for a township somewhere in Scotland, and they wanted riverside animals. So he did a design of this, design of this, design of this. And when it came back, they said, we want an otter. And he said, an otter? I didn't actually design an otter. None of the pieces I put in the brief were an otter. But he went, okay, you asked for an otter, so I'll design an otter, so I'll create an otter. So he does this otter, goes in, and everyone goes, oh, that's really nice. Did you vote for an otter? No, I don't think so. And what it turned out was there was a typo on the questionnaire, and people had voted for other. So yeah, they liked it in the end, and they did get something other. But so I mean, to expect the great British public, or indeed any public, to know their own mind is actually quite difficult. So to some extent, you've always got to give them options, I think. So you could intervene at the planning brief stage. What do you want in the brief? You could then do a consultation again once you've got the tenders and go, okay, well, which tender do you think is, and do you see any problems with these tenders? Because then you can incorporate it into the planning process. it might make it slightly slower, but actually, I mean, I think the planning process is already quite slow. And but not in a good way, and this might make it more effective as a way of reflecting people's needs. I mean, if you just take some traffic design issues, I mean, we did that report with Arup, and when we started the report, we did a series of focus groups with Arup personnel. We had some people who were traffic engineers in the north of England saying, well, actually, this is really important to think just about how people use things like crossing spaces. And instead of thinking about the obvious things, you're making us think about the non-obvious things, about how people cross spaces and what makes people feel comfortable when they're doing so, and how much time you allow, and so on. So, and in that sense, I think, even if you're just getting people to think about it, then you're achieving something. So. It's me, I witter too much, so I apologise.
Any final questions? If not, I'd like to say thank you very much for the 6 out of 7 talk. Thank you very much. So the final slot in the clearing is next Wednesday with Lewis Biggs.